Welcome to Lab 10. So today we're going to be talking about camera system calibration. Specifically, we'll talk about MTF and the determination of other intrinsic camera properties. Distortion is one of the many optical aberrations that plagues optical systems, but luckily we can actually remove this in software, and that's what we'll see in this lab. By taking multiple images, as we did in the lab, we will find that we will be able to create a distortion model and then correct our images so that they look flat and uniform across the entire field of view. In the first experiment, we wanted to measure the size of our camera sensor, and we did this using a microscope objective and translating it across the width of the sensor, and that way we could get a measurement for both the height and width. We also wanted to measure the field of view of our camera with both lenses, and we did this by placing a rod on the optical rail to act as a marker. Then we rotated the camera with the lens on a rotation stage, and we marked where the rod appeared and disappeared from our image. We were then able to calculate the field of view for both lenses. The result is that we measured a field of view of 17 by 39 degrees depending on the height of the sensor for the 8mm lens, and a field of view of 97 by 120 degrees for the fisheye. Based on these measurements, we were able to calculate the pixel size by dividing the length of the sensor by the amount of pixels. And yes, we do love optics. For the next part of the experiment, we wanted to measure the intrinsic camera properties, and so we did this by using a tissue box that had been covered in the checkerboard pattern. We also measured the squares in the tissue box to be 18mm by 18mm. We then took 15 images with both lenses so that we had multiple different angles and orientations of this tissue box. Then using a MATLAB code, we were able to calculate these intrinsic camera properties that you see here. These are the results for the 8mm lens, which includes the focal length, principal point, skew, distortion, before and after optimization. We can also see an orientation map and 3D space of where the camera was placed in respect to the object. Here are those same results for the fisheye lens and also the orientation layout. One important aspect that this code outputs is the distortion coefficients. With this information, we can actually calculate the amount of radial and tangential distortion from these equations. We can also calculate the percentage of distortion, and here we will do that by simplifying it as k1 times r squared, where r squared is the normalized pupil height, or 1 in our case. Here we can see the amount of radial distortion and tangential distortion. We can also see the percentage of distortion for both lenses as calculated using the equations as shown previously. We were also able to use the MATLAB script to correct the distortion in our images. So here we can see our 8mm lens, where on the right we have our corrected image. And here is our fisheye lens, and the distortion is much more apparent here, and on the left we see our corrected image. Based on the MATLAB output, we were able to calculate the focal length of both our lenses. It is important to note that the MATLAB code actually outputs the focal length in values of pixels, which means that we need to multiply by the pixel size. So using our experimentally calculated pixel size, we're able to find our focal length in millimeters. We can now go back and check our experimental pixel size by dividing our theoretical focal length by our experimental focal length in units of pixels. The result is that both pixel sizes are extremely close.
The third part of the lab was about measuring the corner of a box. Were we able to calibrate the camera effectively enough to see that there actually is a 90-degree difference in two corners from the box? In order to do this, we took a picture of the box such that we had two faces that were visible that had the checkered pattern in them. We uploaded this photo into our MATLAB program, which had already been calibrated for the low distortion camera. On the camera GUI, we selected Comp Extrinsic, and then we selected the corners on each of the two faces. Once we did select those corners and it matched them, using our calibration, it spit out a rotation matrix. The third column in the rotation matrix, those three values are the x, y, and z values perpendicular to the plane of the wall that we're measuring. By taking the dot product of this perpendicular vector from both sides, we can find the cosine of the angle between them. And by taking the arc cosine of that value, we're able to find that angle in radians or degrees. In our case, when we did this procedure, we were able to find that our estimated corner angle was 90.9 degrees, which is really close to the 90 degrees that we predicted it to be. For the final part of this lab, we were concerning ourselves with the MTF, specifically how the MTF changes spatially as we move across the field of view of the camera. We did this for both the high distortion and the low distortion lens by using a software called ImageJ and a plugin that allows us to measure the MTF. Using each camera, we took an image of the slanted edge MTF pattern that was available online. Then we used the plugin in ImageJ to determine how the MTF changed as a function of where it was positioned in the field of view. We expect that, since the distortion is higher in the corners than it is in the middle, the MTF will be worse at around the corners than it will be in the middle.